Hello and welcome back to another episode of Drug Cultures. I'm Sky Hawthorne, this is my show. All opinions expressed here are my own, as is all the music. As always, nothing I say on this podcast should be taken as medical advice. I'm not a physician. I do not and will not recommend that anybody take any drug for any reason. All content produced here is for the purposes of education, entertainment, and occasionally harm reduction. Okay, so this is an episode I've been asked many times if I've done or if I'm planning to do. I tell people I host this show, and the way I usually explain it to my friends who might not be interested much in drugs is this is not a drug podcast. This is a history podcast about drugs. And surprisingly often, from friends I suspected had zero interest in drugs, I'll get the question, do you have a Kava episode? What do you know about Kava? Are you planning on making a Kava episode? If you're interested in trying Kava and want to learn more about the science, safety profile, pharmacology, side effects, etc., this might not necessarily be the podcast episode for you. There are many other podcasts and scientific papers that go into exactly this. Unlike with many of the substances we've discussed here on Drug Cultures, Kava is fully federally legal in the United States. It's also, compared to a lot of psychoactive drugs, pretty low risk. There's almost no addiction potential, and while the drug can be sedative or even soporific at high doses, it is highly unlikely to cloud your judgment or even your reflexes in the same way a drug like alcohol would. There is some concern around liver toxicity, but again, the risk seems fairly low if used in moderation. As always, please do your own research before taking any drugs, especially if you live in Europe, because there are some places where it is not legal. In this episode, we're going to do a deep dive into its history in the Pacific Islands, with a focus on Vanuatu in particular, but also on Fiji a bit as well. Specifically, as we've done in multiple other episodes of this show, we're going to look at how Christian missionaries first sought to prohibit and then control the use of kava, which has both religious and political significance across the Pacific Islands. The history of kava is inseparable from the history of these countries themselves, all the way from prehistory through their colonization, independence, and into the 21st century, where prohibitionist anti-kava crusaders still clash with countries that have made kava exports a cornerstone of their economies. You are listening to Drug Cultures. We'll be right back. The kava plant, known by the scientific name Piper methysticum, which literally just means intoxicating pepper, has been a culturally important plant for so long that it literally cannot exist without human cultivation. The shrub is sterile. It cannot reproduce sexually, meaning that all kava plants are clones, propagated by cutting and planting a stem from a mature plant. This process of growing, harvesting, and propagating kava has gone on for thousands of years, and the plant now grows on hundreds of islands across Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia. And you don't need to know the precise geography of what I'm talking about with those words, but basically, you're just going to want to picture a triangle between Australia, the Philippines, and Hawaii, and kava can be found growing basically everywhere in that triangle. Kava was probably first domesticated in northern Vanuatu. That's one of the places where you see the most wild kava, the version that is far less psychoactive but isn't sterile, and from which Piper methysticum was likely domesticated. From northern Vanuatu, it likely spread outward into Polynesian islands like Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, and Hawaii, carried by migrants on sailboats and outrigger canoes across thousands of miles of expansive ocean, and planted wherever the humans who brought it planted themselves. And as kava spread, so too did its ceremonial and cultural use patterns. And likewise did its mythical and religious origin stories. And there are many common themes in all of these stories. One funny contradiction is that while kava itself is sterile and cannot reproduce sexually, a great many of the kava myths ascribe either sexual significance to the drug's effects or to its origins. In many of the origin myths, particularly in Vanuatu, kava is said to have first grown out of a woman's vagina. Even within Vanuatu, the myths are incredibly different depending on which island you're on, or even depending on what part of a given island. Vanuatu is a dazzlingly complicated place. It has by far the greatest language density of any country on Earth. With a population of only around 300,000 people, that's comparable to, say, Pittsburgh or St. Louis, there are 138 indigenous languages spoken. But anyway, despite its sterility, a great many of these many Kava origin myths from Vanuatu have it emerge from a woman's vagina. On the island of Tanna in southern Vanuatu, a woman is said to have been peeling sweet potatoes by the coast when a spirit slipped a magic stone into her vagina, as spirits tend to do. She brought the stone back to the village chief, who examined it, and the spirit appeared to him and taught him that the stone would allow him to grow true kava. The chief is said to have placed the stone in a bowl, sprinkled it with water, and then the next day there were thousands of identical stones in the bowl. Each one went to a man in the village, and that is why the men are now able to grow kava. Women, however, are not allowed to grow kava, and certainly not allowed to drink it, not in the traditional cosmology at least, because at one point it had touched a woman's vagina. Which doesn't make much sense to me, but neither do the patriarchal Western religions we all know and love, so I'm not going to judge too much. In some of these origin stories, kava is said not to grow from the vagina of a living woman, but rather her corpse. In the same way that the vaginal origin myths serve to reinforce a social order of male camaraderie that excludes women, the corpse origin myths connect directly to kava's association with death. In many kava-using cultures, it is seen as a way to connect with the spirit world, a sort of death simulation that allows communion with ancestors or the downloading of wisdom from beyond this earthly plane. In many Austronesian languages, which includes all of those indigenous Ni Vanuatu languages we were just talking about, the words for to die and to become unconscious are the same. There's an idea called linguistic determinism or linguistic relativity that says your language. There's an idea called linguistic determinism or linguistic relativity that says that your language shapes the way you think and experience the world. And it's possible that indigenous islanders saw, and maybe still see, in some cases, kava drunkenness as a form of death. This association is not always purely metaphorical. There's even one example that stuck out to me about a man who was executed for treason and sedition in the early 20th century, and whose execution was combined with a kava ceremony. Once the drink was brewed, the chief drank his kava, and the condemned man was hanged. And according to ancient Vanuatu lore, burying people alive was once a somewhat commonplace practice, and the condemned men were given kava, while the condemned women were not. Burial sites from hundreds of years ago have since been studied, and in many cases the female skeletons showed signs of struggle, while the men's, who had ostensibly been given kava, did not. Given kava's soporific and anti-anxiety effects, this lore may have some degree of truth. Starting in the mid-19th century, Christian missionaries from Western powers began to encounter these kava ceremonies. In some cases, such as with the Catholic missionaries from France, there was a begrudging tolerance for indigenous kava traditions. But from the perspective of the Protestant missionaries such as Presbyterians in Vanuatu or Methodists in Fiji, the kava ceremonies were seen as unclean, heathen practices that needed to be eradicated in order for Christianity to flourish. It's easy to see how some of these practices looked quite literally unclean to an outside observer. In many kava drinking cultures across the Pacific Islands, the preparation ritual includes young people chewing the rootstock before it is dissolved in water. This may have begun because older men were less likely to have teeth, but oftentimes there were precise rules for who was involved in this stage of kava preparation. On Tanna and Vanuatu, it had to be virgin boys. On the island of Rotuma in Fiji, virgin girls. On Tanna, another common practice was to spit the last mouthful of kava into the air as a sort of invocation to the spirits of ancestors. European missionaries expressed disgust at this aspect of the Kava ritual, seeing it, like many other aspects of the ceremonies, as unhygienic. But beneath this disgust at the ostensibly unhygienic practices lay a fear of something much deeper. The idea that any aspect of the Kava ritual had a magical component was seen as pagan witchcraft. And the fact that this spirit worship was not just the worship of false gods, as the missionaries would see it, but a direct communion with ancestors? Well, that presented its own challenge. The Kava ceremony was a tool for cultural self-preservation. Like the Kava itself, the ceremonies could be propagated by the people of Vanuatu to keep their culture alive and to remember ancestors dead and gone. The Christians, particularly Protestant sects like Presbyterians and Seventh-day Adventists, raised many objections to Kava use, and we don't have time to discuss them all, but the central goal was to civilize the inhabitants of these islands and bring them to Christianity. And getting people to abstain from Kava was a great way of putting them out of touch with their ancestors and their traditional religious practices. At the end of the day, they had the same problems with Kava that the Spanish missionaries had with peyote in the New World, which is really interesting to me because Kava and peyote have very little in common in terms of the experience they induce. Peyote is a psychedelic entheogen that can induce profound visionary states. Kava, meanwhile, has effects that are too subtle to categorize within our traditional drug frameworks, though it's sometimes called a sedative hypnotic. Yet in both cases, they allowed individuals to have direct religious experiences. A pre-conquest peyote ceremony was often used for divination, for predicting the future, or just to induce a collective visionary experience. The Aztecs were fervent believers in the supernatural power of both the peyote cactus and psilocybin-containing mushrooms, and the Spanish were deeply threatened by anything that allowed the locals to have a direct religious experience that wasn't mediated by the Catholic Church, which is why peyote became such a direct target of the Spanish Inquisition. And Kava presented the exact same problem to missionaries in Vanuatu, in Fiji, and other islands where Kava use was common. Pharmacologically and experientially, Kava and peyote, nothing alike, but they held the same role in society, something you could eat or drink that would open up a portal to something bigger than us, to the spirit world, a portal that required no church, priest, or preacher to mediate it. Because domesticated Kava requires human cultivation and propagation in order to survive, the process of destroying the use of Kava and eradicating the plant itself were often undertaken at the same time, and can even be considered the same process. In many Pacific islands, such as Tahiti and Hawaii, the 19th century eradication was so successful that the traditional rituals surrounding its use were genuinely eradicated. Some use has returned to those islands in the modern era, global economy and all that, but it most certainly does not resemble whatever use might have existed pre-Christianity. On most of the southern islands of Vanuatu, the eradication of Kava in the late 19th century by Presbyterians was similarly swift and thorough. Yet on the nearby island of Tanna, where Kava use was deeply embedded in not just religious but political life, eradication proved to be more of a challenge. Given missionaries' repeated attempts to force Christianity on the islanders and prohibit Kava drinking, it should come as no surprise that for many groups, particularly on Tanna, Kava drinking became a symbol not just of anti-Christian sentiment, but anti-colonial resistance to British and French rule in Vanuatu. One of the most fascinating examples of this, actually, is a cult called the John Frum movement. More on this after the break. Legend has it that sometime in the late 1930s, a group of village elders met late at night to drink kava and hear messages from the spirits of ancestors. After they had each drunk multiple coconut shells, a white man emerged from the trees and introduced himself as John Frum. According to this man, the people of Tanna had lost their way and needed to reject Christian and colonial habits and return to a life of custom, which is the pidgin English term used to refer to the traditional Ni Vanuatu way of life. Now, it's unclear whether John Frum was a real person, and if so, who he was, but this message inspired a genuine anti-colonial resistance movement. In 1941, John Frum devotees staged their own version of a Boston Tea Party, throwing colonial money and goods into the ocean as a form of protest. Of course, British and French authorities were not happy about this, and they arrested many of the participants, sent most of them to a prison in the faraway capital of Port Vila for years. But this only hardened the anti-colonial resolve of the people who believed in John Frum. When American soldiers began using Vanuatu as a military base against the Japanese during World War II, the people of Vanuatu who were already believers of John Frum saw this as proof of his divinity. Here were a group of soldiers who seemed materially wealthy, respected local customs more than the British and French colonial authorities, and had racially integrated units, which stood in stark contrast to the existing system of governance in Vanuatu, which would probably be called apartheid if it existed today. To the members of the John Frum movement, these soldiers and their comparatively benevolent and racially integrated ways, feels crazy to say about 1940s America, but in this context it's true. These soldiers were spiritual avatars of what the indigenous people of Vanuatu could hope to gain for themselves if they followed the advice of John Frum, rid themselves of the shackles of colonialism and Christianity, and return to a traditional lifestyle of kava drinking and ancestor worship. They believed that this would not just be a return to their old way of life, but a means by which to get the material wealth of Westerners. John Frum is often described as a cargo cult, because it fits into a long tradition of pre-industrialized societies ascribing spiritual power to visitors from the West or other post-industrial societies. But there's another angle to explore it from, and that's the consistent role of cult-like spiritual movements to try and explain or fight back against deep social and human-caused inequities. We talked about peyote earlier, and peyote is now a fairly well example of a psychoactive drug ritual that's linked to cultural self-preservation. But peyote was not the only American Indian spiritual ritual that emerged as a tool to resist the colonization, occupation, and genocide of the 19th century. I'm talking here about the ghost dance, which began in 1889 after a Paiute prophet named Wovika had a vision during a solar eclipse. In this vision, God told him that if his people did a variation of the traditional circle dance, spirits of the dead would return to Earth and fight alongside the living against European expansion. This ghost dance spread rapidly across all the reservations, and the fervor with which American Indians believed in its power was very threatening to settlers. I've made this point before on this podcast, but colonists anywhere feared nothing more than their subjects doing to them what they had done to their subjects. This certainly was true of the ghost dance, which is now probably most famous for leading to the Wounded Knee Massacre, where hundreds of Lakota, mostly women and children, were slaughtered by the 7th Cavalry. The ghost dance as a mass movement died at Wounded Knee, and one of the only reasons that peyote ceremonies have persisted is through the work of peyote advocates who attempted to frame it as a non-threatening alternative to the ghost dance, one that could mesh with Christianity instead of positioning itself in opposition to Christianity. John Frum never became associated with the kind of tragedy that befell the Lakota Indians who participated in the ghost dance. But they both represented a spirituality that attempted to explain and to find a way forward in a world of oppression and colonization from a more technologically advanced society. It's the same reason many Native Americans in the 20th century were drawn to Mormonism, because they had a place in the Mormon cosmology that explained their fallen status, and a promise that through faith and prayer, their status in the world could be restored. If the John Frum movement was a sort of Tana Island-specific version of this ghost dance phenomenon, it logically leads one to ask, well, what's the equivalent of the peyote ceremony here? What was the expression of traditional culture that was allowed to persist? Well, the comparison falls apart a bit when looking at the modern era, because Vanuatu did in fact gain its independence from British and French colonists in 1980, while American Indians never did, and still experience economic and political oppression to this day. So Kava survived in Vanuatu and in fact flourishes to this day, but usually in less of a religious context and more tied into national identity. Even in pre-colonial history, Kava had political purposes and was often brought as a gift to a rival chief or opposing political faction as a way to end disputes or wars. In the 21st century, Vanuatu is majority Christian, but many Christians will drink kava, and it no longer carries the same negative connotations even with faith leaders. Kava drinking is just part of what it means to be ni Vanuatu. But in Fiji, the dynamic is a bit different. While Vanuatu's population is almost entirely indigenous ni Vanuatu, the British in Fiji had a decades-long policy starting in the late 1800s of bringing indentured servants from India to work on sugarcane plantations. This created a cultural, economic, and political divide between the indigenous Fijians, nearly all of whom were successfully converted to Christianity by the start of the 20th century, and the Indian indentured servants who came to be known as Indo-Fijians. So to this day, only around half the country is indigenous, and virtually all of Fiji's indigenous inhabitants are Christians of some denomination, while the other half, the Indo-Fijians, are mostly Hindu or Muslim. Unlike in Vanuatu, where the idea of custom or the old way of life is seen as traditional, in Fiji, Christianity is seen as traditional. It was adopted in all its various forms by tribal leaders 150 years ago. Less discussed is the fact that these chiefs and tribal leaders were pressured very heavily by missionaries. Groups like the London Missionary Society pressured local political leaders not just to abandon their traditional ways, but to destroy any culturally important artifacts, such as kava utensils, and the Tanoa kava bowls out of which kava was traditionally drunk. Today, it's true that kava is widely drunk on Fiji, and sometimes still in a spiritual or ceremonial context, but it is also regarded with suspicion by many Christians, who are uneasy of its association with ancestor worship. But this resistance no longer comes from colonial authorities. Fiji gained its independence more than 50 years ago. The resistance comes from the very indigenous Fijians whose ancestors once regarded it as a core component of their culture and spirituality. Some Fijians regard kava with more than suspicion, and in the 21st century, a movement led by Pentecostals has begun to advocate for its prohibition and eradication once again. The way that Pentecostal Christianity is practiced in Fiji, I'm not going to mince words, it looks like Christian nationalism, which is alarming to see anywhere it pops up. Central to the value system of Pentecostal churches is the idea of being born again, which in practice means that Fijian cultural customs, including kava, which may have existed side by side with Christianity for decades, are now seen as threats to Christianity. Many of these Pentecostal ministers are particularly threatened by that ancestor worship component of historical and ceremonial kava use, seeing it as the work of the devil. In 2004, a Fijian pastor named Atu Vulauno founded a Pentecostal church called the New Methodist, which quickly gained notoriety after receiving the endorsement of Fiji's most famous rugby player. Immediately, Pastor Atu began a crusade against kava, relaying a vision he'd received of a snake swimming in a kava bowl, and insisting that this vision meant that the devil was using kava to pull people away from God. Pentecostal ministers now frequently call kava the devil's liquid. Sound familiar? And have even staged public prayers for people who choose to renounce kava. In 2017, a video of one of these prayer events went public, and it drew a lot of condemnation from ethnographers and museum curators, because it turns out it wasn't just a public prayer. Villagers were told that if they burnt their kava utensils, some of these are old, ancient relics, God would bless them with wealth and economic development. So that's exactly what they did. Kava bowls were brought forward, destroyed with an axe, and then burnt, just like they had been when the London Missionary Society first arrived. In many ways, this is the exact opposite of the John Frum movement. Instead of a white man telling people that rejecting Christianity and embracing tradition would bring about material wealth and social change, here we have a Fijian man telling people that only through rejecting tradition and embracing hardline Christianity will they be able to gain the wealth and economic development they need. Pastor Atu has gone so far as to say that Fijians who drink kava should replace it with alcohol, in spite of the mountains of evidence pointing to the dangers posed by alcohol, especially to cultures like Fiji without a long history of its use. The dangers of prohibition, whether religious, political, economic, or cultural in origin, should never be discounted. But there's good reason to suspect that, at least in Pacific Island countries like Fiji and certainly Vanuatu, the prohibitionists and anti-kava crusaders will not succeed. And that reason is economics. In Fiji, kava is the top agricultural export crop, bringing in some $20 million annually. In Vanuatu, kava is the top export crop, period, across all categories. And I am certainly not one to minimize the dangers of reorienting a country's economy to focus entirely on the export market. In fact, there's real concern that a lot of Ni Vanuatu people can no longer afford kava. But I think many Pacific Islanders, even if they have religious or moral objections to kava use, recognize that any sort of prohibition or kava eradication campaign would have disastrous economic effects. So if kava is such a huge export industry for these islands, where is this product going? Well, there are some European countries where pharmaceutical low-dose preparations are used in the treatment of anxiety or other conditions, but for the most part, kava is enjoyed around the world for its effects, or as a replacement for other drugs or alcohol. As I mentioned at the start of this episode, I've gotten a lot of requests to do an episode about kava. It's become a surprisingly well-known drug here in the United States, at least. Now, many listeners will be disappointed to note that when I do an episode on the long history of opium in China, for instance, I don't go out of my way to actually try opium. I've never tried peyote, in spite of doing multiple episodes on the topic, and I've certainly never tried diethyl ether. But kava, unlike many of the drugs we've discussed on this podcast, is both legal and widely available where I live. And in fact, there's a kava bar just down the street from me in Portland, Oregon. So before recording this episode, I decided to brave the war zone, dodging Molotov cocktails thrown by Antifa super soldiers until I was finally able to order myself a shell of their strongest noble kava, which had been imported directly from Vanuatu just that week. The kava bar looks a lot like any other Portland coffee shop, but the energy is palpably quieter. The bartender served me my drink in a plain wooden bowl that looks virtually indistinguishable from what you'll see if you look up traditional kava bowl on Google Images. I drank my kava and made small talk with an older couple who'd been sitting at the bar when I walked in. The windows were lined with cacti and hanging plants, and on the sofa chair a man sat with his laptop open. As I drank the kava, I noticed almost instantly a tingling sensation on my lips. It was not the first time I'd had a kava beverage, so I knew to expect that part. Then a subtle yet distinct quieting of the mind. I wasn't sure whether or not I'd notice any ancestral spirits calling to me, but I think maybe I needed to be in a different headspace. The effect, while pleasant, did not feel spiritual in the slightest. I suspect that, like with many other ceremonial or entheogenic substances, the ceremony is just as important, if not more so, than the substance. Satisfied with my first shell, I ordered another to go and walked home to record this very episode. So I hope you enjoy what you've heard. I hope you learned something. You've been listening to Drug Cultures. Stay tuned. As always, if you enjoyed what you heard, give us a follow on x.com, the Everything app. My Twitter handle is @DrugCulturesPod. Give the show a follow at consciousness_cultures on Instagram. or shoot me an email at drugculturespodcast@gmail.com.